Sunday School Leader. I'm Jim Monroe. Well, at least that's what my name tag says. Let me tell you a quick story. Gosh, it was probably 3, 4, 5 years ago. I was in town going to the hospital and all that, so I had my name tag on, and I was coming back to the church, and I had to stop in at the grocery store to pick up something. And so I wheeled in, and as I was walking in, I realized I still had my name tag on. And I thought to myself, I just had that fleeting thought, I better behave, be on my best behavior, because people will know who I am, that I'm related and tied to First Baptist Church of Whitehall. And as soon as that thought came into my mind, then I also thought, well, shouldn't I be like that all the time? Now, it's not like I normally go in and I'm a troublemaker or anything, but it was just one of those quick little thoughts that sunk into me, that reminded me whose I am and who I belong to, and I should act that way all the time. That's kind of similar to what we're talking about this week. Remember, we're in the unit entitled Nehemiah, Building a Life of Service. We're in session 4. It's entitled Protect, out of Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. And the point of the lesson is that as Christians, we cannot separate who we are from what we do. So here we are in Nehemiah chapter 5. We're seeing that as Nehemiah and his fellow Jews continue to do God's work. We noticed last week that they made it through the threats, the jeers, the potential warfare. They made it through that, and now the workers themselves are in crisis. You see, they're working on the wall, and they are volunteers. They don't have what many of us have these days, which is vacation time or paid time off, anything like that. And so their household money, or their grain, was dwindling. And most of the folks back then probably lived day to day. It's not like they had the savings accounts and the retirement accounts and anything like that. They just lived day to day. And there were those expenses they had to pay, like their taxes and all that. So they were actually having to borrow money to pay their taxes. And they had to mortgage their fields and mortgage their land in order to survive. We get down to verse 6. And we see Nehemiah's response to the plight of his fellow Jews. He's angry. Now, he pondered it first before he said anything. He didn't make that off-the-cuff accusation. A lot of times when we're presented with something and we get angry, we have an immediate response. But we see Nehemiah, we've seen this throughout the whole story, that he has this calmness about him, that he ponders things, he prays about things before he acts. So we certainly should take that to heart. So, isn't that what we're supposed to do? What does James 1:19 say? James 1:19 says that, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So that's a good lesson for us. Not just a lesson, that's a command for us. Quick to listen, hear what's going on, then slow to speak, slow to become angry. Now, in Nehemiah's response, he addresses the upper class Jewish people. It says, you guys have been charging interest to your fellow Jews. And to us, that's not a big deal. That's just the world that we live in. We borrow money to buy a car, to buy a house, whatever, and we're getting an interest rate. Now, but back then, a Jew was not supposed to charge interest to another, or to a brother or sister, a fellow Jew. In fact, you can look at Leviticus chapter 25, verses 35 through 38, and see the direct command there about not doing that. Now, does your church, does my church, do we as Christians today, do we fall into the same trap? And I don't mean about charging interest, but I mean about taking advantage of people, or maybe treating lesser fortunate people or poorer people differently than we treat those with means. Well, James chapter 2 addresses this very well, about how we treat those who come to our church who are well dressed and appear to be rich versus those who are poor. And so the question is, who would be treated better in your church? Would the new physician in town and his nice-looking family, or perhaps that single mom who's down on her luck? Both of them are visitors that day. Who's probably getting the better treatment? And it's probably not a conscious thing, at least I hope it's not. But let's be aware that we're not doing that even subconsciously. Let's strive to treat everybody the same way. We'll get down to verses 6 through 11 in Nehemiah chapter 5. We see that Nehemiah confronts the upper class folks, and he says, what you're doing's not right. And then they were convicted, and they agreed to pay back what was due to the people that they had extracted interest from. We get down to verse 13, and Nehemiah addresses those wealthier Jewish folks again. And he says, okay, you guys have made your promise. If you don't follow through, if you don't keep your promise, just as you have left your fellow Jews destitute, God will shake you out. And he takes his robe and shakes out the folds. And he will leave you, empty. He will shake everything out. He will leave you just in as bad a shape as you have left these fellow Jews of yours. That's a very threatening thing to say to a wealthy person, that they could become poor. All right, here's some points to ponder here from this lesson. Perhaps you would like to discuss some of these in your class. First of all, it's not a sin to be wealthy. And then kind of the opposite of that, it's also not necessarily godly to be poor. Selfishness and greed affects all people across all socioeconomic levels. Right? These wealthy Jews claimed to be God's people, yet they didn't adhere to God's rules, to his commands. They took advantage of the less fortunate. And the question is, how do we do the same thing? What are some of those commands, those rules, those things that God wants us to do that we just skip over? That if we had the whiteout Bible, that we could just white those out because we're not paying attention to them anyway. A lot of jokes in Southern Baptist circles is the gluttony issue. We'll gripe about homosexuality and we'll gripe about adultery, but when it comes to the potlucks and gluttony, well, that's another thing, and we'll overlook that. How about being a cheerful giver? The list can go on and on, so you might want to bring that up in class. Also, is there a sin in your church that has gone unconfronted? Okay. This charging interest to lesser fortunate Jewish folks, that's been going on for a while in our story. And for some reason that was either overlooked or tolerated or not thought about or whatever. But it took Nehemiah to stand up against what was wrong in order for it to change. Is there something going on in your church, in your Sunday school class, in your family, or maybe in your own life that has gone unconfronted that needs to be addressed? All right, another thing to think about. A leader leads his people, but that also involves correction. Leading is fun when everything's going great, the wall's being built and all that stuff, but when correction needs to come, when this discipline needs to happen, that's when it's not quite as fun to do that. All right, let me close with this story. When my daughter was in junior high school, maybe even early college, when she was home, and she would go out either on a date or she would go out with some friends or whatever, one of the last things we said to her as she went out the door is, remember whose you are. W-H-O-S-E, whose you are. Remember whose you are. And we had talked about this ahead of time, so we knew exactly what we were talking about. First of all, she carried our name. She was a Monroe, all right? And so anything she did would reflect on us as a family. So just keep that in mind. Also, she was also a child of God, and anything she would do positively or negatively would also reflect on how God was perceived. It would reflect on Christianity, it would reflect on her church. And so just always gave that as a reminder to her as she went out the door. Similarly, let's remember whose we are. We are children of God, and we need to act accordingly. All right, guys, I appreciate your watching. Don't forget to pray for your class. I certainly appreciate you.